to university. Her papers also receive national awards for the competence and research. Second, she's a star in my book because she studies research with real-world relevance. She studies moment-to-moment changes in children's responses to media, so like smartphones and tablets and TV, and how these responses affect the play and the learning of young children and even infants. How on earth does she do this? She uses a very innovative methodology where she tracks the movement of children's eyes as they watch screen media. And in addition, she studies how parents can use screen media more effectively with their children. And third, she's a star because she makes sure that her research does not sit on the shelf. She does a lot of speaking to parents at forums like this, and she does a lot of consulting to help design educationally valuable programming for children. So she's consulted with PBS Kids, with Sesame Workshop, with Nickelodeon, with Common Sense Media, and the Institute of Medicine. So thank you so much, Heather, for taking time on a Sunday, one of your 2 days off every week, to speak with us on such an important topic. We really appreciate you coming. Thank you. Lois, can you hear us? Can you raise your hand if you're hearing us? Oh, good, good. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Karen, for the very kind introduction. And thanks everybody here in the room and on Zoom. It's very nice to be here and talk with you. As Karen implied, this is one of the best parts of our job, is to be able to connect with real people talking about research, but not just research, but sort of translating research to real world applications. So what I will do today, I love the Q&A portion of these kinds of forums. So hopefully you've come with some, I leave you in the next half hour with some questions that you have that I'm happy to talk about. So I've planned for maybe filling 35 to 40 minutes, probably about 35 minutes of our time together. So we have plenty of time for conversation. And what I try to do in this kind of forum is really focus on not the nitty gritties of the research, although I'm more than happy to talk about how do we know what we know and then what don't we know. But I try to talk about just highlights. Here's what we know, here's what matters most, and then talk about practical tips for parents and grandparents and teachers and others to use media mindfully and in a positive way with young kids. And so one other, just kind of considering the scope, my research is mostly, as Karen said, with infants and young children. So usually birth to 5 years is the age range that I tend to look at in my research. But I certainly teach on school age kids and adolescents and social media and some of those things. So in my formal remarks, I tend to focus mostly on those youngest kids. But I'm happy to answer questions or connect some of those concepts to older kids and teens if that's helpful. So please feel free to ask about that during Q&A. And maybe just a final contextual remark. I'm more than happy to be interrupted and answer questions midstream. So please feel free, folks in the room or folks on Zoom, just shout out a question or raise your hand or something if you have any questions in the middle. I'm more than happy to pause. I'm not a particularly formal presenter, so please feel free to interrupt. Okay, so oops, make sure I can actually move my slides. Since the spring of 2020, I've started every talk with this slide, and it still feels very relevant to me. So I've been asked to talk about kids and screens, especially since spring of 2020, where folks say, oh my gosh, kids are having so much more screen time. This is terrible. What should we do? And so one of the things I like to start with is saying this is not normal. So when I talk about the research and what we know about kids and screens and what the recommendations are around kids and screens, all of those things were developed prior to spring of 2020. So the current context is quite different. So I try to always tell parents in particular, this is not normal. Please be kind to yourself. Don't worry so much about what you should or shouldn't do and how many minutes per day kids should have with screens. This is a very different context than what the research was really designed to, the context in which the research occurred. And the third point is the most important thing for infants and young kids is that they live in a place where they feel security and love. If parents can pull that off, they're doing just fine, and no amount of screen time is likely to have any harm for kids if those other needs are being met. And I feel like it's always important to contextualize any research on kids and screens in that bigger picture, that if screen time occurs in the context of a safe and loving environment, it's probably just fine. So I will always end with this slide as well, so you'll see this again. So with those really important caveats in mind, I have two main goals today. One is to focus on the 3 C's of media. So I'll tell you what that is in a moment. But the 3 C's of media use is how we tend to think about what makes for positive media use in children's lives and what might be potentially harmful. So the 3 C's are content, context, and child, and I'll talk about each of those in a few minutes. Second goal is to share concrete strategies for having a balanced or healthy media diet for young kids. So focusing on the research in the 3 C's, and then concrete strategies and tips that parents and teachers and caregivers and grandparents can use. So I could spend not just the next hour, but the next 10 days talking about all the research on all of these things. What is the impact of media on aggression, self-esteem, violence, obesity, learning, memory, attention? So we could talk for an hour about any one of these topics. And if you have specific questions about any of these topics, I'm more than happy to talk about that. But instead of talking about research on individual outcomes and what the strength of the evidence is, what I really want to say here is there's research on all of these things. Some of the research says digital media causes harm or TV causes harm. Some research says, actually, we found a positive association or a positive impact of digital media on these things. And lots of research that says we found no association between digital media use and these things. So I can talk about any of these and what predicts whether it's positive or negative at any point. But really, what I want to focus on is what makes a healthy media diet. So here's my visual anecdote for what we mean. So if you went to your nutritionist or your doctor and they said, let's talk about your nutrition. How many cups of food do you have in a typical day? What else might you want to know? You might say, okay, I might need a new doctor, because unless you're at the extremes. So if you think about a typical young child, if they have far too little food access, that's a problem, and we need to know that, and we can intervene. If they have far too much food intake at the extreme, then that's a different kind of problem, and we can intervene there. But for most kids, they're in the middle. It's not just about the quantity of food. It's not just about how many cups or ounces of food they eat. It's about the quality. So we want to know not just how much food they're eating, but what kind of food is it? What's the context? Are they having family meal times where they can sit down and engage with others? Or are they eating in front of the TV by themselves, for example? So we would want to know a lot more about the content or the substance of the food they're eating and the context around which they have food. Do they have a kind of set schedule where it's predictable when they're going to eat? And so I think of that as a good analogy for screen time. We want to have a similar way to think about screen time. So it's not just about minutes per day. So just like with food, if you know how many minutes per day a child or a teenager spends with media, you know a little bit about what's going on there. But what's much more important is the substance of that media use. Does that make sense? So keep this visual in mind, this idea of a healthy media diet. And I'll come back to this concept a few times about what makes a healthy media diet. The research can really be summarized. Lisa Guernsey, an author, summarized the research as the 3 C's. And this continues to be my favorite framework. It's not like a fancy scientific theory or anything. It's just a nice way to think about what does the research say about kids and screens. And it boils down to the 3 C's. I'll talk about each one of these. So the content, what are they watching or what are they using? The context, how, when, with whom are they using media? And then the individual child. So some kids respond very differently to the same media than other kids. So let's go through each of these. When we think about content, this is really the what. If we're talking about our W inquiry words, what are kids using? And that could be what information. So is it alphabet on Sesame Street, or is it a violent cartoon or some other thing? So it could be the information. It could be the format. Is it a video chat? Is it a TV show? Is it an app or a game or a website? And it could be the specific feature. So how is it constructed? And is it constructed in a way that's child-centered and really focuses on how kids learn best? So those are the content pieces. And I've tried to just summarize in one slide each of these points. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So here I've got basically 3 basic categories for content. So educational on the left, and I use Sesame Street to represent that because I think it's something most, if not all of you, are going to be familiar with. So educational content is typically associated with positive outcomes for kids, whether that's academic outcomes, learning outcomes, social outcomes, like emotion regulation. Educational content in the research is typically associated with positive outcomes for kids, if any. So a lot of the research shows, well, it doesn't really matter. If they're watching educational TV, it doesn't really predict any outcomes. It's kind of neutral. Some research says it's positive. If we come over to the right side, we have violent content. And I have just a goofy cartoon to depict that, but I'm quite sure you can all imagine the kinds of things that would go here. The research almost invariably says exposure to violent content is associated with negative outcomes for kids. Again, whether that's academic and learning achievement, whether that's social and emotional development, violent content, especially at younger ages, is associated with negative outcomes generally. And then in the middle, there's this kind of general entertainment category. My go-to example used to be SpongeBob SquarePants. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but Tom and Jerry, like these kinds of things that are like maybe fun and entertaining, but they don't really have an educational goal. I guess Tom and Jerry is a bad example because some folks might consider that having more violence than they would like for young kids. But those kinds of cartoons that are sort of entertainment, but not educational, not violent, they're just kind of in the middle. And the research typically says for young kids that it's associated either with negative outcomes, like lower attention regulation or lower social skills. Most of the research says it's not really associated with anything. And that partly depends on kids' ages. So for the youngest kids, even just entertainment content tends to be associated with negative outcomes, language development, attention development, those kinds of things. So because they don't learn very well from TV at the youngest ages, it sort of displaces important things in their lives. So that kind of general entertainment tends to be negative for younger kids, tends to be kind of neutral for older kids. So that's content in a nutshell when we think about educational versus violent versus something else. And then the last thing I'll say about content for now is that interactivity sometimes helps young kids learn. So there's a lot of folks believe that TV is mindless and passive, but a game or an app or something is more interactive and therefore better for learning. That is true sometimes. This is just one picture from my research with a child playing with a little app we created. Sometimes they learn better from that interactive experience, but sometimes not. So sometimes just watching a video is better for learning, especially for preschool age children. So sometimes interacting just gives them too much they have to do, that they focus on the game itself, not the lesson. But when they can just watch, this is another picture from one of our studies where they just watched a recording of somebody else playing that math game. These kids actually learned more than kids who played the game themselves. So all I'll say about that for now, and I'm happy to talk in more detail later, is the research is really mixed on whether watching a video or interacting with a game is better for learning. And there are a lot of it depends answers there. So it depends on a lot of things. So I'm happy to talk more about that later if you're interested. Catch my breath a little bit with the mask on. Okay, so our first C is content. Our second C is context. So this is the lots of other WH questions. When, where, how, why, with whom are they using media? So what else is happening in the environment? Is it right before bed? Or is it in the middle of the day? Is it together with a caregiver? Or is it solitary? And what is the reason? Is the use of media to calm the kid down because they're upset and parent needs a break? Or is it, we want to connect with our grandparents, let's log on a video chat and talk to someone far away? So the why, the with whom, the when, those kinds of things. And this is content, our first C has been studied a lot. Context has been studied a lot less, but based on what we know, it matters quite a bit. So one of the things I like to show when I talk about context is this figure is showing for kids in the US, birth to 8 years old, how many minutes per day on average do they spend with screens? When you do this online, I ask people to click on the screen and tell me like, oh, do you think it's like an hour a day or 2 hours or 3 hours a day? How long per day do you think kids spend with screens? And it looks like the images may be cropped off a little bit. Let me see if it'll show up here. Oh, okay, that's showing up. So if we look at TV and videos, on average, they spend, about an hour and a half to 2 hours per day with TV and videos on average in the US. And of course, there's a lot of variability there. And you can see kids under 2 years old, that's this first blue bar, they're spending 45 minutes to an hour per day on average. Preschool age kids are spending a bit more. And I find a lot of folks are surprised by this because they expected it to be a lot higher. For media games, that adds a little bit more time. And then other digital media, that could be video chat, it could be taking pictures on a digital device or something. If you add this all up, it comes to about 2.5 hours per day on average for kids in the US across this age range. About an hour per day for the youngest kids under 2, and then a little bit higher for preschool age kids. And so you might wonder, okay, Heather, why did you give me this huge graph if the bars only land over here? That's a little deceptive. And the reason I do that is because one of the topics I study that most people forget exists is background television. So this is the amount of time kids in the US on average spend in the presence of television somebody else is watching. So imagine like a baby playing with toys on the floor while a parent is watching TV. And this, it looks like their Zoom window actually even covers it. The bar actually goes a little bit further. So for kids in the US, on kids 0 to 8 years old in the, oh, thank you, Emily. So for kids in the US, 0 to 8 on average, it's about 4.5 hours per day, compared to about an hour per day of kids actually watching TV, to an hour and a half, 4.5 hours per day. And for the littlest kids, the kids 0 to 2 years old, that's more like 5.5 hours per day on average for them. And for some kids, it's all day. So the research suggests for kids birth to 8 in the US, about a third of them live in a home where TV's on all day, every day, even if nobody's watching it. So that is very rarely looked at in the research. So the research often says, how much does your child watch TV? And we're only capturing this bit over here. But really, when we say how much is your kid exposed to TV, even if they're not watching it, much, much higher. Does that make sense? And what's not shown on this graph would be, this is just background TV, but there's also more recently the term technoference, like interference, but with technology. That's like a parent looking at a cell phone, for example, while they're with their child. Then that could be an extra bucket that adds more time. Okay. So when we think about background TV, so for me, this is part of the context. Is it in the environment, even though they're not watching it? And our research shows, I just pulled a few snapshots. When infants and toddlers are playing in a room with TV on, when they're not watching it, it's just in the background. We see 90% decrease in the length of play episodes. So how long do they play with toys before they get distracted and move on to something else? 25% decrease in the duration of focused attention. So that's a particular kind of play when they're really engaged and not very distractible. So decrease in focused attention. We see 33% fewer words they hear from parents when there's a TV on, and a 21% decrease in parents' engagement in that play. So how much time do parents spend, for example, sitting on the floor playing with the child? So decrease in all of these things when the TV's on compared to when the TV's off. And all of this research is happening in a lab setting where we turn the TV on and off. So it's not the TV the parent chooses to watch at home necessarily, but it's TV that we put on in the lab. Make sense? Any questions? Like I said, feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or clarifications or comments, please feel free to interrupt. So I mentioned also related to context is this newer term technoference. So that could include background TV, but can also include this kind of scenario, right? So parents are looking at a mobile device, for example, while their child's with them. So this is this kind of behavior is associated with lower self-regulation in kids and associated with lower learning. So when parents are trying to teach their kids something like a new word, if the parent is distracted by their phone or something else, then kids are less likely to learn that new word, for example. So technoference can include background TV or other kinds of media. But if we look at the other side of context, like what else could this look like? We have something called joint media engagement. So that looks more like this. So a caregiver and a child using media together in an interactive way, as opposed to separately. And this is associated with a whole different set of outcomes for kids. Increased engagement in the activity itself, increased comprehension for what they're looking at, increased learning that they can take with them later on. And I didn't list the whole list here, but it's also associated with reducing the harmful effects. So if little kids see something scary on TV, for example, they're less likely to be afraid later in the day, like remembering that information if they're watching with a parent who helps them get through the moment. So joint media engagement, using media together with young children, is associated with an increase in all the good parts of media and a decrease in all the potentially harmful parts. Makes sense? So joint media engagement, that's one of the phrases we want to remember. And then our last C, so we have content, we have context, and the third C is the child. And this refers to,
Well,
so sorry.
Yeah, going back for just a moment,
Oh, yeah.
conceptually, it seems like you're suggesting that parents and people around children need to parent themselves with regard to what they're watching and interacting, as opposed to being worried about what the kid is dealing with.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And we'll come back to this idea. One of the phrases I used to use, and I use a different phrase now that you'll see later, but I used to say that one of the number one things you can do is behave yourself. Behave yourself with digital media. And because as you all know, kids, little kids especially, learn so much from observation. They learn what people in their environment model for them. So if we're very distracted by our mobile devices, or if we watch a lot of television, then kids observe that and think that that's the best way to have a relationship with media. You're exactly right. So one of the best things that parents and caregivers and others can do is have a healthy relationship with media themselves, and have screen-free moments for themselves and model that behavior. And you're exactly right. We'll come back to this exact topic. But yes, parenting themselves and managing their own screen time is one of the best things parents can do. Manage their own screen time, and then when they use media together. And sorry, I said ask questions whenever you want, and then I ignored the questions. I apologize. Just shout out and get my attention if I don't see you. Partly my glasses keep fogging up, so that's part of the problem. Okay, great. So our third C is the child, and there's a whole lot as it goes into this. It's the who of media use. And so I'm sure you all know this already, but different kids respond differently to media, as they do to anything else. There are individual differences. We're all different. And so when you think about, trying to think of a good example, should I be worried about my child becoming addicted to screens? No, probably not. But for a small subset of kids, they might have trouble regulating themselves with screens, just like a lot of us have trouble regulating our behavior around something. So every kid's different. Some kids will struggle with media. A lot of kids will benefit from it if it's used well. So it really depends on the individual. I won't talk in too much depth about this. I'm happy to come back to it later. One of the biggest individual differences that matters is age. So I've only put up the two younger groups that we look at here. So for infants, 0 to 2 years old, relationships matter, screens don't. So for kids 0 to 2 years old, they learn best from real people. They learn relatively little from screens. So they'll learn much better from somebody doing something in person than that same person doing the same thing on a video. There are some exceptions there, and it doesn't mean they don't learn from screens. It just means they have a much harder time learning from screens. They really need someone in the room helping them learn from screens. The one big exception there is shown here for video chat. Even the American Academy of Pediatrics, some of you might be familiar with their rules around screen time, like no screens under 2 years old. They have even lifted that rule around video chat. So they recognize relationships matter most. If that relationship is being built over FaceTime or Zoom or something like that, it's still building a relationship, and that's what matters. But for things like apps and videos and things like that, babies don't learn a whole lot. For preschoolers, 2 to 5 years old, the story is a little bit different. At that point, they definitely can learn from screens, especially if it's a well-designed, age-appropriate media. But they will learn more with support, like in this joint media kind of scenario. So if they're using media together. For older kids, kids older than 5, they can definitely learn from educational media. Then the question really becomes, what is the lesson you're teaching them? Are you modeling positive social interactions and high quality educational content? Or are you modeling nasty social behavior or disrespect or being unkind? So for kids over 5, it's really about the content at that point. But I would just add, there are a whole bunch of other individual differences that matter beyond age. So I mentioned before, self-regulation. So most kids are fine with media, but some kids have trouble turning the device off and walking away to do something else. So that is true for some kids. So I always tell parents and other caregivers, you know your child best. So if I say, oh, apps can be great and they can learn so much, and you say, not my kid. My kid has a tantrum every time I take the tablet away. I'm not going to do it. I say, totally fine. Totally fine. You're not ruining them by not giving them that experience. Same for cognitive skills. Some kids learn best in some situations than others. Some kids will learn more from media than others. So it really depends on the individual child. So that third C, the child, is a big piece of this puzzle as well. So to sum up that part, 3 C's, content, context, child. If we keep these 3 things in mind when we think about digital media for kids, that's getting you most of the way there. Choosing good content, making sure it's a context that enriches media rather than having media replace an enriched social interaction, and then focusing on the child and what works best for them. Any questions at this point? Check this. I don't know how well I'll be able to see on Zoom, but feel free to shout out if anybody sees someone raising a hand on Zoom. Okay, great. So I said the second goal was the concrete strategies for ensuring a healthy media diet or a balanced media diet. So this is where I'll ask you to brainstorm a little bit. So I'm sure you all recognize this kind of picture. Full disclosure, I'm not a nutritionist. I don't know if this is the most up-to-date version of a balanced diet, but just we can use that as sort of an analogy for what makes for a balanced media diet. So we could think about a child's day the same way. So if we wanted to divide up a child's day, imagine this is 24 hours for a child, what kinds of things would we want to put on this plate or in this day? So maybe I'll just ask you guys, if you're willing to sort of shout out some things like you want to make sure that child gets what in their day. What's that? Sleep. Yes. Oh, I love this. Is always the first thing folks say, and that's like half of the pie for littlest kids, right? Sleep. Absolutely. Other things that come to mind? Food. Did I hear? Yep. Meal times. Yeah, absolutely. They need, and ideally, and so one thing I think about is, could this be screen time? And you guys list the 2 that, like, the 2 I would say should not be screen time. Sleep should be screen free. Meal time should be screen free. Those are like the 2 parts of this pie that I say should be screen free if you can manage it. All the other ones I think could involve media, and I'll talk about examples in a minute. But are there other things that you feel like kids should, like every kid should have this in their day? Play. Exercise and play. I heard. Was there something else I missed? Exercise and play, exactly. And play means lots of things. It could be play outside, getting exercise. It could be toy play, problem solving with toys and that kind of thing. It could be social play with other people, all of the above. Reading, is that right? Yep, yep. Reading or being read to, yep. Absolutely. Outdoor time, yep. I heard one-on-one time, so focused interaction with a sibling or caregiver maybe, that's not distracted, ideally, yep. With outdoor time, I heard, I don't know if it was an optometrist, ophthalmologist, I should know the difference, an eye doctor of some kind, someone who does research on vision, who said, the biggest risk to vision for screens is not getting enough sunlight. She said, I don't care if your kid's on an iPad all day, but send them outside to do it. So I thought, I mean, I'm not sure I would recommend being on an iPad all day outside either. But this person was saying, if you're worried about vision, sunlight is one of the things that kids aren't getting enough of. So outdoor time for many reasons. So I think you hit on a lot of the main ones. So these are just examples, but sleep you got. So I always put that in the biggest slice of pie. Family meal times. So I feel like you sort of generated things in exactly the way I think about it. And I mentioned these two are the two things that I feel like are hard to do well with screen sleep. I would say if there's one topic on that first slide I showed with all the different words on it, sleep is maybe the most consistent in terms of the research on screen time. Sleep is better when it doesn't involve screens. So that should be screen-free. Meal times, I personally loved when my child was in middle school, maybe Friday night was like pizza and a movie night. And I'm okay with a day a week, like not having to think too much and just sort of watching a movie and spending time together, have pizza night. But as long as they have most days of the week and most meals that are screen free, I think is a good recommendation. And then we've got physical activity, you said. And to me, that could involve screens. One of my favorite ways to exercise in the current moment, since I'm not going to the gym, is to play a video game where you dance along to the music. So that kind of thing is a great way to integrate screens to enhance those activities you want rather than replace them. Outdoor time, we said, and exploring the world, reading or being read to, and play. And so for some of these things, it's important that part of this pie is screen-free, one-on-one time that's really focused and engaged play or reading, spending time together. Meal times is another great way to ensure that. So focus time, one-on-one time that's not distracted by screens. But some of these other things, like reading an ebook together, this could easily be an ebook, and that's just as good. So some of these things could be screen time. And then sometimes there's just leisure time. Like, yeah, you can just doodle on an iPad and not have to have a goal for that other than creativity or entertainment, and that's fine too. Does this make sense of thinking about, like, what do we want to fit into the day? Let's make sure we've got that. And in fact, just this weekend, I was reading a new study. This was with teenagers, I think, but they were saying that screen time was only an issue for development. I think they were looking at school achievement. It was only a problem if it was outpacing or displacing sleep and exercise. So if kids got enough, the recommended amount of sleep, and they got the recommended amount of exercise, they were pretty good. Screen time wasn't so much a problem then. So it's really about fitting all that stuff into the pot. Okay. So one recommendation is think about the pie. What do you want to go into your plate or your kid's day? Another recommendation is to have a plan. And I don't know how well you can read this in the back, so I'll just read through these. Having a plan is super valuable because it means we don't have to react in the moment. If we have a plan, we can say, okay, these are the rules we've agreed upon for screen time, rather than saying, oh, you're begging for a TV show and we don't have a plan, so fine, just watch the TV show because you're begging for it or whatever. So being able to plan rather than react is valuable pretty much into all parts of a parent's life, really, but especially with screen time. And the goal for this plan should be to scaffold children or help them learn how to manage their own screen time rather than micromanaging it for them. So we don't want a plan that says you can do this, you can't do that, so many minutes a day, and just kind of micromanaging every moment of the child's day, because then they don't learn how to regulate themselves with media. So we want to sort of create an environment where they're part of that planning process and they learn how to manage their own screen time. So the first part of the plan is basic health and safety. What are the non-negotiables? So for a young child, or I would argue any child, the bedroom is a screen-free zone. You can't sleep with your phone in your room, for example, or with the TV on. So that could be a non-negotiable. So certain places or times. For older kids, it might be, we don't text while we drive. No phones in the front seat of the car. That could be a non-negotiable. So you might have a few health and safety related non-negotiables around sleep or driving safety or things like that. Or if you're using social media, I have to be on your account so I can make sure you're not meeting folks I don't want you to interact with. So that kind of basic health and safety. Beyond that, it's really about clear routines. So that's related to the time and space. When and where can you use media? But that could also be how much time can you spend with media, or how many minutes per day or whatever. So having clear routines that are agreed upon by everybody, and especially as kids get older, making them a part of that process is helpful. So everyone agrees upon it, everyone follows it. And that means parents too, parenting yourself. If I say you can't have your phone at the dinner table, I can't either. And we all agree upon that. Similarly, clear consequences. So if the rules are violated, if the child doesn't follow the rules, what's the consequence? If the parent doesn't follow the rules, what's their consequence? So those kind of rules can be created together and agreed upon by everybody. And then the last bit is revising and revisiting that family media plan as kids get older and as kids demonstrate responsibility. So that comes back to this scaffolding idea. So rather than just saying these are the rules, end of discussion, you might say, we're going to do some training wheels with media. Here's your first new phone, for example. Here are the rules. And as the child develops skills and demonstrates responsibility, you might revisit that and say, okay, you don't have to charge your phone in my room at night. We can charge it in the living room, as opposed to under lock and key in my bedroom, for example. So you can sort of revise this plan as kids get older and show responsible behavior. Makes sense. And then I wanted to share a particular tip in case there are parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles in the room who want a specific idea. Healthychildren.org, I don't know if you can read that here, but I'll just say it again. Healthychildren.org is a website run by the American Academy of Pediatrics, so pediatricians in the US, about a range of topics. They have advice about all kinds of things. This is the organization that makes recommendations for car seats and bike helmets and lots of other things, the amount of sleep kids should have. So they have all kinds of information. But among other things, they have this site where you can create a family media plan. And I'm happy to pull it up later if you want to see what it looks like. But basically, when you create your family media plan, you put your family name in. So you create your kind of account. And you can enter your kids. So if you've got a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, or a 2-year-old and a 12-year-old or something, you can enter your kids in there. And then you can create a media plan. So I created just a fake little one. My kid Cecilia is 22 now, but let's imagine she's 2 to 5 years old. And then we can check boxes to say, when you're in the car, you can't be on a mobile device, for example. So you can check the rules you want to put in your family media plan. And they have different rules for older kids than for younger kids. So you can put in the kids' ages and then choose which rules you want to have in your plan. I generally like this tool. I do think it's a little bit too focused on don'ts, not enough on do's. But they do have some, for example, when we use media, we will use it together. That's one of the rules they have. So they have a few things you can do, but I wish it had a little bit more on the positive things. But they do have a space to add your own rules. So you could actually say that, add some more positive things you wanted as well. So I recommend that tool for folks who are looking for a place to start in creating a family media plan. Make sense? Any questions about that? Okay, so think about the media diet and what to put in kids' day. Think about a family media plan. And then I find I often get questions or folks are curious about kind of practical tips about a few things. So I'll just give you a bit of a list of things, but I can talk about anything in more detail later if you'd like. Monitoring use is one of the top parent tips. Just know what your child's doing. What are they doing? How much are they using screens? Who are they talking to if they're on social media? So just monitoring, just being aware. I think that's one of the best things parents can do. Minimizing secondhand screens. That's that background TV and technoference I mentioned. So be aware of not just your child's screen time, but what are you doing around the child? Or what mindless habits might you have? A lot of people turn the TV on in the morning and they just never turn it off. Not because they like to have it on, but it's just habit. So being mindful of that is helpful. Talking about media and how media makes us feel. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the monitoring use. Ask your kids, oh, who did you talk to today? Or what did you watch today? Or what's the game you're playing? Tell me about that. Can you show it to me? So just talking about media can be really helpful, especially for older kids as they get more independence and autonomy with media, asking them, checking in. And in particular, I use a little happy face here to remind me to say, asking about how it makes them feel as well. How do you feel when you watch TV for 2 hours and don't take a break? Or how do you feel when you play that particular video game? So talking about media can be helpful. And then I mentioned before, I would come back to this idea of being a good role model. So this used to be behave yourself, but now I try to be a little kinder. Be a good role model. So think about your own media. What examples are you setting with media? Okay, 2 more points, and I want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So let me just get through 2 more main points. One is about how to find good content. So one of the most common questions I get from parents and teachers and others is, yeah, but let's say I want to use, let my kid play with apps. How do I find good ones? What do I actually look for? So one tip is the website 0to3.org. 0 to 3 is a leading nonprofit organization that makes recommendations for kids under 3 or birth to 3. And they have they worked with some researchers to develop E-AIMS. So they just call it E-AIMS. And it stands for finding content where kids are engaged. So is there a story or a lesson that's engaging, that's keeping them there, or are they just kind of tapping at random? Are they actively involved? So that's the AI. So do they look like they're really concentrating and thinking about the content? Or again, are they just kind of swiping through things without much engagement? The M is meaningful. Does it relate to my child's own life? So can we find connections? So even if that means, oh, those TV characters went to a zoo. Do you remember when we went to the zoo? Oh, what did we see there? So making that connection so it's meaningful. And then social. Is the child interacting either with a caregiver who's using media with them or with the game itself? Are they interacting in some way that makes it an interactive experience?
Breaking or brand new.
Makes sense? Was there? Okay.
But maybe for grandparents who aren't with their kids a lot, it's just good to know.
That's not a question. I said I could. Oh, just okay. Just making sure. So these are things to keep in mind when you're thinking about media for kids. Is it engaging? Are they actively involved? Is it meaningful to their lives? And is it a social experience, either with a person on the screen or with somebody in the room? So those are some things to look for. In terms of actual titles, my go-to things, PBS Kids Parents page is great. I think if there was one place I could tell you to go to find content that's likely to be good for young kids, it's PBS Kids. And the parents page has a place where you can put in the age of the child. And then if there's anything in particular you want to do, like I want a hands-on activity, or I want a video, I want science, or I want math, you can put in some of those filters and it'll give you a bunch of ideas. One of the reasons I love it is it's customizable in that way. But another reason is that, well, and it's good content. It's usually evidence-based, research-based good content. But also it's not just media. So they have examples for like, oh, you want to do science with a 3-year-old? Oh, here's a kitchen idea you can do to bake this thing and talk about the amounts. And so they have like off the screen examples as well. So if parents are just looking for an idea on a rainy day and they don't know what to do with a bunch of young kids, it's a great place for recommendations. commonsensemedia.org is another great place. If you haven't heard of Common Sense Media, they have educators who rate, oh, it's TV shows and movies and apps and games and websites and books, sort of every type of media. They don't really go under 2 years old. Their policy is kind of probably not worth doing much if they're under 2, but from 2 to 18 years old, they'll kind of make age-based recommendations across that whole range. PBS Kids is focused mostly on kids 8 and under, but Common Sense Media has up to 18. And so if there's a new movie out, for example, and you want to know, is this my grandchild wants to go see this movie? I don't know. You can look it up on Common Sense Media and it'll tell you, is there violence? Is there scary content? Are there positive role models? And what I love about Common Sense Media, they have so much content. I couldn't even try to summarize it for you. One of the things I really like is they have a section that says, what can parents talk about? okay, you're going to see this movie together. Here are some tips, things you can talk about. Are there uncomfortable, inappropriate, outdated depictions of race? If so, here are some tips to talk to them about that and why you don't like that depiction of race, for example, or violence or scary media or role models or whatever else. So they have great parent tips. And they also have lists that parents love. I guess these are the most clicked on links on their website. Oh, what are the top 10 books for math? What are the top 10 shows for science for preschoolers? So they have these top 5 or top 10 lists that parents really like. And then childrenandscreens.com, it is a nonprofit organization, but they have great videos. So if there's anything you're interested in, like, self-esteem and loneliness and social media, like is social media making my teenager lonely and unhappy? They have YouTube videos where they have an Ask the Expert series that are free and online. So you can watch their Ask the Expert series on a whole range of topics. And they also have a bunch of parent tip pages that are free on their website. So these are 3 go-to places: pbskids.org or pbs.org/parents, commonsensemedia.org, childrenandscreens.com. And then the last thing that I always end on, this is the most common question I get, is how do I find good content? The second most common question I get is when I want to turn the TV off or I want to take the iPad away, how do I do that without a meltdown? So I started creating this slide just to have concrete tips on how to transition away. Some kids will really struggle with this. Some kids will be just fine. Everybody knows their kid and how easy it's going to be for them to let go of the device and move on to something else. But here are some tips to make that easier. One, I've already talked about that family media plan. Establish consistent routines. When kids know what to expect and what the rules are, any transition is easier. This is especially true for little kids. Having consistent routines is really important. I like to recommend choosing meaningful transition points. So what used to be common, at least when I was a kid, is like minutes, being very focused on minutes. When the time's up, the time's up. That is endlessly frustrating for any of us. If someone turned off the TV in the middle of your favorite TV show, you'd be really mad about that too. So choosing a meaningful time point, like the end of an episode or the end of a level of a game or achieving a certain achievement in a game, those kinds of meaningful endpoints will be easier to transition away from than just stopping at a certain minute. Rewarding good self-regulation. This is something most of us don't think about. So if you say time's up, game's over, hand it back, and kids do it, we usually just move about our day. Instead of saying, thank you so much for giving that back when I said time was up, that made me feel really grateful. So if you kind of acknowledge and call out the good behavior, rather than really focusing on the difficult moments, then that can be rewarding in and of itself, sort of rewarding good self-regulation. Providing attractive alternatives. So my mom is wonderful, but to be honest, when TV was up, it was like, go find something to do. Instead of saying, okay, TV time's up, why don't we go blow bubbles in the yard or something, like providing an attractive alternative. It is totally fine for even little kids to say they should learn how to entertain themselves. I am totally fine with that. Not every minute needs to be structured. But if your child has trouble transitioning away from screen time, providing an attractive alternative they want to do could be helpful. And then just, again, be a role model. So model what that looks like. So if you say, I think I need to stop using my phone, my eyes need a break, or, oh, I'm feeling a little zoomed out, let's go outside for a bit. Kind of talking aloud and modeling what it looks like to say, oh, I think I've had enough, I need a break from this. That can be really helpful. And then, like I promised I would end on this page, these times are not normal, so all these rules might look a little bit different right now, or maybe that family media plan needs to be revisited during unusual times like school closures. Be kind to yourself and just make sure kids feel safe and loved, and everything else will be probably fine. And that's it. I'm happy to answer other questions. And same for folks on Zoom. Feel free to ask questions or comments.
Are there people studying this for older kids as well?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. So there are a lot of folks who focus on early childhood like I do. There are a lot of folks who study adolescence and really different kinds of media like social media, Facebook, Instagram, that kind of thing. And then there are folks now who are saying everyone's ignoring kids in the middle, school age kids. So there are a bunch of folks now really focusing on that age group. So people tend to focus in on an area. Is there a particular question you have about older kids, or you're just
Well,
wondering if it's happening?
From one teacher talking about cell phones with kids, that they actually start to shake and get really upset if they can't have their cell phone with them.
Yeah. There are folks who study, are studying things like anxiety around phones, and the fear of missing out. FOMO is a common one folks will study. And I think it's still uncertain to me what's going on there, that if the phone itself is the problem. So for example, there's a researcher who's done a lot of studies with college kids, so older teenagers, I guess, and young adults, where he'll have them, some days he'll take their phones away when they enter the room, the classroom for class that day, and then measure how anxious they feel or how worried they are and stuff. But what they're not capturing is the context of that. So like some kids have, family members who are sick. And so having their phone with them might alleviate concerns they otherwise would have had. So it's not clear if the phone is causing that anxiety or if that anxiety already existed and the phone is actually alleviating it. Like I certainly felt that way. Like, oh, I have a phone. If my kid's in trouble, I will know right away. I don't have to go to work for 8 hours and just hope everything's fine. So for me, it certainly alleviated some worry. So it's hard to know exactly if the phone is causing that anxiety, or just a tool kids are using to manage anxiety caused by something else. Does that make sense?
Somehow we managed to get by without phones 50 years ago.
That is true. I used to say that a lot. That is true. Although there was I heard a parent comment once that changed my thinking about this. And one of them was, when I was a kid, there were payphones on every corner and I knew how to call home if I needed to. That's not true anymore because of cell phones. So I used to think that, like, my kid doesn't need a phone. I got fine, by just fine. But you bet I had dimes in my pocket everywhere I went, and I could find a payphone wherever I went and call home if I needed help or needed a ride. And because of cell phones, that's changed. So I struggle with this idea myself too. Like, we got by just fine. So how did that happen?
I'm not quite sure what my question is, but let me just kind of babble. Middle-class parents who did a lot of the hands-on, I guess the question is, what about poor people in terms of just the skill set for helping the access to media? I just had the feeling that you were speaking primarily to middle-class folks. And I don't know if that's true. I guess that my question is kind of
Yeah,
out there.
no, it's not out there. It's a very good question. It's totally on point, actually. So one of the things I find encouraging, so we've always talked about the digital divide, or different phrases for this, that higher income families can afford all these great things, lower income families might not. The reality is, right now in the US, the digital divide has totally closed. So the vast majority of families have an internet-enabled smart device. So they have access to apps and ebooks and things like that. And it's actually one of the most equitable things we have versus something like this. So something like this, there is a digital divide still, but a smartphone is not. And so a lot of researchers see the smartphone, apps, and digital games as a way to kind of bridge gaps. Like, you might not have this, or you might not have books. You might be in a situation where you move around a lot because of financial instability, for example, or employment instability. So you can't have a bunch of books. You move around a lot, physical books, but you can have a smartphone that has access to the local library's ebook collection. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but it's sort of like that smartphone in a way maybe related to this idea of, like, there aren't payphones everywhere and you really need internet access to access a lot of resources. That smartphone is like the lifeline for lower resource families, and they will pay for that before they'll pay for high-speed internet access in the home, for example, or a laptop or something. So we're still trying to understand that a bit. The other thing I would say is a lot of the things I talked about, like potential learning benefits, for instance, some of the research shows those benefits are greatest for lower income kids who might otherwise not have access to resources. So one of the things I think about a lot is displacement. So remember that pie plate or whatever, the pie chart. When you think about what you want to fit in your day, it's really easy for me to say, oh, my kids should be at the zoo and the library and the science museum. That's where we should be going. But that's because I have the luxury of taking them there, paying for it, and taking the time from work to go do those things. Not all families do. If they're a single parent or working 2 jobs to make ends meet, they don't have the time or resources. Maybe they live in an unsafe neighborhood, or they don't live in a place with parks nearby. So families who don't have access to those resources might benefit more from something like Sesame Street. Whereas my kid probably wouldn't have benefited much, because if I'm going to the science museum every week with her, that's probably providing some of that school readiness that she might otherwise not get. Does that make sense? So for me, a lot of it's about what would you be doing otherwise? If that TV show is displacing playing outside in a safe park with kids in the neighborhood, that's really different from having nothing better to do, or if you're watching a good show instead of a violent one, for example.
We're getting close to the end. I wanted to see if anybody online has questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand on Zoom. I'll ask my question, which is, as fully formed adults who probably spend more time with screens than in retrospect we wish we did, are there strategies that you've seen that are helpful for being a better role model, including if you're used to having the TV on all the time, are there baby steps toward having it on less of the time?
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, some of it is what I often talk about with parents is, can you find an hour or 2 a day that is screen free and focused? So it might not be never have the TV on, because that's a big jump. Some folks are just really used to it, and it's kind of distressing to not have that noise. But can you find an hour or 2 per day? And if that means physically leaving the house, like we'll go to the park and leave our phones at home or whatever, can you find an hour or 2 per day that is screen free? I think meal times is another good way, like a good chunk. Like we can say this chunk of time will be screen free. And I feel like getting an hour of focused one-on-one interaction in the day is the most important goal, as opposed to cut out the screen time. It's really fit in the focused screen-free time. Does that make sense? So
Yes.
finding sizable chunks like meal times or an hour after school every day, some kind of chunk that feels manageable, can be a good place to go.
Thanks.
Yeah. I rambled more than I thought I would, so sorry.
This is great. Oh, Nancy.
Hi, I'm Lois. Can I ask a question?
I know I saw Lois's face before. We can hear you, Lois.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know that I have a question. I just have a frustration. I have a 7-year-old granddaughter staying with me overnight, and all of my grandchildren, they always beg for, one of my devices so that they can watch something. And what Josie now, the 7-year-old, she's always watching YouTube. Well, there's kids YouTube or there's adult YouTube, and maybe I should just sit down someday and look at those things myself to see what the possibility is. How can I, it's 10 o'clock. We've been up since 6. She's probably been on it now for 2 or 3 hours. And of course I liked it so I can watch this now, but.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lois. YouTube is interesting. There are researchers really focusing on YouTube in particular now, because it's the most used streaming medium for young kids, for sure. One of the things that's gotten a lot of interest for YouTube, exactly what you were just describing, that it can autoplay, right? So it can be kind of this endless thing. Whereas if I'm watching PBS Kids on PBS, that show will end eventually, and something I'm not interested in will come on, and it's sort of a natural endpoint. Whereas YouTube can just keep going. And Lois mentioned YouTube Kids. That's been really controversial because it's not curated by a human. It's an algorithm that curates it. And that means folks can easily find ways around that algorithm. Like if we just put in the words, Disney and Mickey Mouse, then it'll get picked up as YouTube Kids content when it might not be. So there's controversy around YouTube Kids. Basically, clicking YouTube Kids doesn't ensure it's high quality content. What I recommend more is finding a particular channel. So I mentioned PBS Kids before. PBS Kids has their own YouTube channel. And so if you're on that channel, it won't loop into other content. And that way it's kind of curated. commonsensemedia.org I mentioned, they, I believe, have some YouTube channel recommendations in particular. So in terms of finding content that you feel good about, those are good sources. The other question I heard in Lois is the amount of time. So where do we put an end to that amount of time? That's where, unfortunately, I think the only and best solution to that is to invest a bit of effort in creating a playlist. So you can say, okay, we're going to watch a few episodes. Here's your playlist. And when that playlist is done, it's done. Because otherwise YouTube will just play what, I'm sure you've all gotten in these loops. I sure have. Like then, oh, that's interesting. And you just like the videos just keep coming. So it doesn't give you that natural endpoint that broadcast TV would. So if you create a playlist, then it's kind of an enclosed space where you go through the playlist and then it's done. So Lois, I don't know if that totally answered your question, but some of those other things I mentioned, like is setting an endpoint, like 2 more episodes and then you're done or whatever, 2 more videos. And then we're going to do this other thing. Like, what are you going to do next? That can be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to come back to your introduction of our presenter. I thought I heard, and maybe incorrectly, something about among the things she studies are eye movements.
Yeah,
Okay, so I don't think you touched on that.
no,
And it made me think of Diane Gooding in psychology and psychiatry.
I'm not familiar.
Well, here at the university, who for years has been studying eye movements as it relates to individuals with schizophrenia, as well as their parents. And so I don't know if there's any relationship, but I wanted to just throw that out. And if you don't know her, and I don't know what your study is of eye movements, but there is another person on campus, but focused on a particular disease condition.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't aware of that. So I didn't talk about that. I just thought it might bore you to tears if I talked about the details too much. So some of my research uses eye tracking. So we track eye movements really as a way to figure out, are kids understanding what they're watching? And how can we design media in a way that they can understand better? So one of the things that I focus on in my research that I didn't talk about much today is, okay, kids are going to watch television. How can we help media creators produce better television that's more comprehensible and more beneficial? So tracking eye movements is one way that we can do that. Say, oh, kids are really distracted when there's a bunch of stuff in the background. So if we can have a solid background, for example, with the character talking about an important detail, they're more likely to look at the right stuff at the right time, for example. So one thing we find is that really young kids often don't even know where to look. So one of them's looking here and the other's looking here and the other's looking here and one's here. It's hard to create a video that's educational for all those kids if they don't know what to look at. Whereas when adults watch TV, we all look at the same time as each other. We're like, no, we're expert TV viewers. We know what to look at. Little kids don't know that yet. So media creators kind of intuitively, I think, have a sense of this, and they'll have like a pretty bland background with the character's face as the most vibrant and vivid thing on the screen, for example. So that's how I've used eye tracking. So kind of a different thing, but eye tracking itself is a method that's kind of tricky. So it's always nice to know other folks who are using it. Yeah, thank you.
I think we're at time. Thank you very much, Heather.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks so much, Karen. And thank you everybody for on Zoom and in the room. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer other questions if they come.
Thanks a lot, Heather. I remember her job talk was the best job talk I saw in 20 years. She showed us where kids' eyes were watching, and they weren't watching the main story. They were just all over the place. It was just a great job talk. So
Oh,
thanks a
I
lot.
should have shown those videos. They are really, I'm happy to show them. if
Thanks a
you're
lot.
interested. Thank you, Karen. Take care, everybody.